Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. It's finally race week yet again, but the Christian Horner investigation still looms large, and rumour emerging today from Sky Sports that a decision has been made. A 100-page, potentially, document has been issued to Red Bull, and they will announce the decision over the next couple of days. Is this good or bad news for Red Bull and Christian Horner and the team going forwards? Massively intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, thought this is worthy of note. We have Max Verstappen, Daniel Ricciardo, among many others, playing a bit of, do they call it paddle, whatever you want to say. Here's Fernando Alonso, we've got Lando Norris, Charles Leclerc, etc, etc. But I will say this image was, I thought, kind of interesting, right? So we've got Lando and Max, we know they're good friends. Of course, Danny Rick is eyeing up the seat next to Max Verstappen, you would well think, at that Red Bull car, and I'm sure that Fernando Alonso is doing the same. Let's not forget, Alonso has made it very clear publicly that he's ready to go, he's ambitious, he's obviously the man for the job as far as he sees it for potentially Mercedes, but also potentially for Red Bull as well. Let's not forget that it is quite likely that next year Red Bull will have a different driver in their car for Sergio Perez, not for Max Verstappen. Of course, that is true for Mercedes, and Alonso has definitely been putting his hat in the ring to be George Russell's partner in next year's Mercedes, but I'm sure that also applies to Red Bull as well. Alonso's been saying a lot about, he's the only world champion that's still quick and, of course, available on the market because Verstappen and Hamilton locked down for next season. So Alonso's been trying his best, and maybe the extent of that is off the track as well, and in the relationship he builds with certain drivers over the next couple of months, in addition to what he's trying to, I'm sure, get Flavio Briatore to do behind the scenes and cooking up a potential deal somewhere or another, because I think Alonso really realises that last season was when Aston Martin were going to be at their best, and this year is not going to be the same thing. So Alonso, in Alonso way, will be looking for alternatives in the near future, and I'm sure Mercedes and probably Red Bull are right at the top of that list. We know that Max and Alonso get on well. Whether Red Bull would be keen to do that is another question, and also whether Toto would be keen to put Alonso in the team alongside Russell, because, that could well be fireworks. I'm sure that it would be, frankly, and therefore I'd rather like to see it. Marco has also said that Perez, well, if he drives well, then sure, we can talk about an extension, but I think the feeling is, especially because this car, last year's car and even the year before's RB18, definitely didn't suit Max to a T at the start of the season. They brought upgrades, Max loved the car, and bang, Perez gets annihilated. This year, it looks like that's going to be the case from day one, which is problematic for Perez's future in the team. Every year for the last 3 years, Perez has become, I would say, less competitive compared to Max, and I don't expect that trend to go anywhere anytime soon. But getting into the Christian Horner allegations, there's been so much going on about this over the last couple of days. Even Ford last week made a statement to effectively say, we're not particularly happy that Red Bull Racing are not being so forthright with us about the whole situation. Ford, of course, partnering with Red Bull as an engine partner for 2026 and beyond as it stands. The belief is that if they want to pull out of that deal, they can do so effectively at any time. This would be a major partner, of course, for Red Bull to lose if they were to do so. The belief is that the Thai side of Red Bull is still, maybe until today, who knows, supportive of Horner, and the Austrian side wants him gone. So this is one of those partners that might force that side of the business to change their mind if they were to, potentially. But Jim Farley, Ford's CEO, went even one step further yesterday and made another statement to Red Bull saying the following: Ford is increasingly frustrated, however, by the lack of resolution or clear indication from you about when you anticipate a fair and just resolution on this matter. We are likewise frustrated by the lack of full transparency surrounding this matter with us, your corporate partners, and look forward to receiving a complete account of all the findings, then demanding they give a prompt and serious attention to the matter. So, I mean, how about that, right? The other day, they were basically saying, all right, guys, sort it out. Now, Ford are basically saying, I mean, it sounds like they're just saying get rid of Horner, aren't they? Because if they want a clear resolution, of course they say it should be just, but it seems the implication is, if you are going to keep Horner, you're going to have to give us a very good reason as to exactly why you are going to do that. So we don't know what's going on with Horner, whether he's innocent or guilty or whatever. There was an update on this yesterday, though, that said that reportedly there are nearly 100 pieces of evidence introduced during a deposition of Horner, who allegedly offered his accuser a 6-figure settlement. Now, we heard about that one before. The 6 figures, by the way, is meant to be 650 grand. So pretty big deal. we just don't know too much more to it. There was this from Eddie Jordan as well, just before we discuss the update. And whether you agree with his assessment or not, there is no doubt that this kind of situation has had a major consequence on Horner's reputation, whether rightly or wrongly, but also on Red Bull themselves. Eddie Jordan says, I've seen a lot of bad decisions, but the Red Bull situation is the most absurd thing that I've ever seen. Does anyone seriously believe that the employee made up these accusations out of thin air? If Horner is innocent, is she guilty? The damage to Red Bull's image is already huge. Someone has to pull the ripcord now, basically saying like it's just time to go and get this whole thing over with. And the feeling in the media was, and still is, that Horner will be departing from the team. It's just a matter of time. And that then brings us to the latest update here from Sky Sports F1 on the fact that the external investigation into Christian Horner, from what they believe, has now understood to have been completed. This is what the article goes on to say, that, so here we go. The external investigation carried out by a specialist barrister. Now, we then heard the rumours that this specialist who had been carrying out the investigation just disappeared and went on holiday, apparently, as soon as this whole thing went down. So I don't know what happened to that, but apparently it's now been done, and the report, which is extensive and runs well over 100 pages, is now in the hands of the board, who will ultimately decide whether Horner remains in his dual roles of team principal and chief executive. A decision is expected to be made and communicated on either Tuesday or Wednesday when Horner returns from Bahrain back to the UK, before then going back to Bahrain, I guess, for the weekend for Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So yeah, this is a big update for sure, and the feeling is that a decision has effectively been made, or at least the investigation has been completed, and therefore the findings of said investigation, and therefore the recommended conclusion, I suppose, has now been determined. What Red Bull will do is a question. Whether it's a slap on the wrist, whether it's Horner's gone, that remains to be seen, and the implications of Red Bull remain to be seen as well. Do they get Wheatley and Jonathan Wheatley to step up into this role? Do they put many people across what Horner used to do, or what's going to be the situation? This was mentioned today, coming out of Formula Uno, on exactly how Red Bull have packaged their cooling, especially. Even James Allison mentioned this the other day, that he's been very impressed at how Red Bull have managed the cooling for their car, because ideally you want to slim the car as much as possible and make the cooling and the radiators as effective as is possible. And one of the big talking points of 2022 was the fact that Mercedes had seemingly worked engineering miracles with their W13 to have such a, slightly packaged zero-pod concept and yet still cool the car. Now, the car wasn't perfect in cooling. Australia, Spain, such examples that season, but they thought it was a sacrifice worth making. But Red Bull has further ideas to go even further. Apparently even its sister team, it's funny because RB, that in my head is Red Bull, but it's not. It's V-Carb, Racing Bulls, Toro Rosso is what I might still decide to call them, to be honest. Even RB cannot 100% follow them due to Red Bull's unique cooling, and the feeling is that, there's basically no chance that teams are going to be able to replicate this. This even is the analysis on exactly how they are managing their cooling. We know that they've got this fascinating double side pod inlet, and there's even rumours that potentially come Japan, they might even turn up with a smaller side pod than even this. So, it's not quite a zero pod, but it's definitely the slimmest they've gone for so far. And apparently that even comes down to the Honda power unit. The way that power unit is structured means they can construct a cooling system in a better way maybe than other teams can. Of course, 2026, that advantage maybe goes away because, not with Honda anymore, and of course, brand new set of engine regulations as well. But the feeling is that if anyone tries to copy this idea, it's going to take them 6 months to do, if they want to try, and if they do, then Red Bull, of course, would already have taken a step forward. So, that is the scary thing for the other teams. And even Pierre Wache was discussing the decision to take some ideas from Mercedes. We saw the shoulders at the back of the car, the cannons, whatever you want to say, but also the side pods bearing some resemblance to what we have seen elsewhere. And he says, look, don't be emotional. Sometimes you've got to step back and say, hey, they did a good job. But I thought this is what was nice at the end of it in terms of how confident they are. And he does say, look, it's not exactly the same, to be fair. It's a lot better. So saying that what Mercedes have come up with was, it was nice ideas, guys, but we are executing similar concepts, but in a much better way. And Verstappen has been saying the same thing as well. Red Bull, though, do believe that Mercedes will be closer than they appeared at testing. Even James Allison would know that he was very confident, it seemed, after the test, based on, if you analyse the body language from the post-testing interview. interviews saying that, Ferrari seem okay, we seem okay, and, in British person speak, we seem okay, as usually we're pretty damn good. And even Helmut Marko said, to be fair, he says this every year, but he did say it again, as for Mercedes, I'm not sure about their testing approach. They are definitely faster than they showed us. That is probably true for every team, and it's, we believe, true for Red Bull in large part as well. But I will just mention this in an AMuS article. So 2 big AMuS articles today. One of them like a big long run testing analysis from the data, and then the other one on the cost cap we're just about to get into. But this was an interesting quote where they mentioned that from their analysis on how much fuel they believe the cars had, and also looking into it that if someone comes into the pits and they come out like 2 minutes later, they've pretty much just changed tyres. Whereas if they come into the pits, go into the garage, come out again, they've almost certainly replenished the fuel. And according to the analysis, Red Bull, Mercedes and Aston Martin, they were the teams that did everything they could to disguise their true form and, maximising the refueling between stints. So it seems like of all the teams that were sandbagging the most, probably Red Bull and Mercedes. There was also a belief that despite the fact that Ferrari might have been running a higher engine modes, they were possibly running more fuel than Mercedes were, so that might counter some of the discussion. But even Aston Martin was interesting that maybe they are more competitive than they appear, because Alonso's times at the end of the weekend were actually only a few tenths off max, which is pretty damn good, because a few tenths off max is better than Perez right now. So maybe Aston Martin doing a bit of sandbagging as well. But the other misdirection in the sport at the moment is no doubt on the cost cap. And ever since it's come into effect, there's been lots of drama, lots of debate as to whether it should even exist, whether it's actually a positive for the sport, and whether the teams actually adhere to it or not. We know that in 2021, Red Bull were punished. Apparently they were punished. I haven't personally really noticed, for breaking the cost cap in 2021. And of course, this is Formula One. At the end of the day, the teams will try their absolute utmost to explore every possibility, every possible loophole, everything that which is almost cheating, but not quite. The teams, of course, will like to explore. They'll do this on every set of regulations, and if you put in financial regulations, they will, of course, do the same thing. So the Formula One teams have been doing this, some quite probably more than others, and we'll discuss which teams those might be in a second. But the belief is that, according to the FIA, teams are abusing holes in the cap that the FIA is incapable effectively to police. So this mainly comes around to part-time working team personnel. This has been the way that teams have been doing it. They take an employee and they decide, okay, we're going to put you on the Formula One project for this percentage of the time, and the other times you're going to be working on this project and this project. Then what they can do is they can say, hey, you might be making 250 grand as a top engineer or whatever to work on these projects, but we're going to give you 220 grand of that from your 50% of the time you work on, the RB17 or the hypercar project or whatever, and then we're going to give you a very small salary for your Formula One stuff. So therefore, that's what counts towards the actual budget cap, and that's what time counts toward the budget cap. But can anyone actually tell you how much time they're spending on the Formula One project? Quite possibly not. So shout out to Junaid here putting all this on the timeline because it's paywalled, but I'll leave the full article down in the description box below as well if you guys want to check that whole thing out. So this is what you'll see with these teams. Before the cost cap came into effect, roughly 1,000 employees for some of the top teams. Nowadays, you're looking at 1,500 employees. So how's that happened? The teams you'd expect to get smaller because, less money on the table. And the way the cost cap works, the top 3 employees, which I think excludes the drivers as well, their budget or their salary doesn't count. So, Hamilton's 100 million at Ferrari, that doesn't mean they've got 30 million left to spend, 35 million, whatever the number is. It's like 135, 140 million now, the cost cap, and they used to spend 400, 500 million dollars. But people would argue they actually still do. They just don't tell you where they're spending it. But the vast majority of employees, whatever they're getting paid, that counts under the cap. So the expectation was that, they would have less employees. That's not the case, however. They're actually hiring more people. This is because they're hiring workers as part-time workers. So to achieve this output, you're hiring half-day or even quarter-day workers, especially for those with high salaries. So this is what Red Bull have done with Rob Marshall, who is this individual here in the middle on the podium last season, who has now gone to work at McLaren, actually. And I imagine other teams have done this as well. But if there's any team that's pushed the boundaries the most on the cost cap, we believe it's Red Bull based on what we've said over the last couple of years. This is also, we think, the the strategy they've employed with Adrian Newey. So Adrian Newey is their top guy and is the mastermind behind a lot of what we see on that Red Bull car. But he is a consultant. He works on the RB19 project, and yeah, sure, he works on the Formula 1 car, but not as much as you might believe. Now, maybe that's what they say publicly. The reality is slightly differently, because Rob Marshall apparently was working on the RB17 50% of the time, 40% of the time on Red Bull powertrains, and only 10% on the Formula 1 project. So only 10% of his salary is included in the F1 racing team's operational budget. Is he only working on the F1 team 10% of the time? I don't know the answer to that, but if you had to speculate, you might expect it to be a little bit higher. Red Bull is said to have founded 5 subsidiaries to distribute its people accordingly. Other teams, of course, have done the same thing. Suddenly, Formula 1 teams are building bikes and boats, which is true for, like, James Allison went to work on the boat project or whatever it was at Mercedes. So, you know, the teams are going to abuse this, and it's just impossible for the FIA to police, and that's the issue with this, especially the current implementation of the budget cap. Is like, how do we know that it's actually being followed? Because it almost certainly isn't in the way that the regulations are written up. And the FIA are like, well, you say you're only working 10% of the time there, so yep, I guess that's fine. And that way they can keep top engineers and still pay the big money, because the money isn't coming from the Formula 1 team, it's coming from the other projects, and therefore they're only spending 10% of their time on the F1 team. And apparently the same thing has been used for Newey as well. And even the rumour was that if they do enforce what they're trying to enforce, Newey, because obviously they're paying a fair bit of money for what he does for the team, will either have to go or just work on the RB17 hypercar project full time, or they'll have to find another solution. So to get rid of this problem, from 2026, they will be saying 100% of the salary will count towards the budget cap. So no more 10%, 20%, whatever BS that these teams are pulling. If you work on the Formula 1 project, whatever you get paid at the bottom line will go to your salary or go through to the budget cap. So I guess you would wonder whether this will still do anything. Like, is there still a way that Red Bull or any other team can create a new company, a new division that isn't even part of Formula 1 at all, but yet they still get paid for something and there's some way around it? But this is the FIA's intention to actually shut this down, and James Vowles apparently says a real step towards more justice. There was even discussion further on in the article there that McLaren apparently unhappy about, that some individuals from Red Bull recently went straight to Toro Rosso. It's funny that AMuS still called them Toro Rosso. The rest of us now probably say RB or something, Racing Bulls, but you know, AMuS is still sicker with Toro Rosso, which is quite nice because at least you know what they're talking about. But apparently Red Bull have just been shifting people from the A team to the B team to reduce the budget, and that's not really something that other teams have access to be able to do. So there's a few reasons here why Red Bull have probably been able to do more under the budget cap than should have been expected, and from 2026, so it's going to be another year really, but apparently all of this 10% BS is going to stop. So I would expect, if this comes true, that these teams are going to have to start laying off lots of staff, and if they can no longer do the part-time, quarter-time thing for some of their top engineers, then they're going to be forced out, which probably means that for some of the maybe redistribution of talent, as it were, it might open the door to that slightly more. We believe at least that Ferrari, and even Lewis Hamilton was discussing on exactly why he joined Ferrari today. He actually said a few things that we hadn't heard before, that he didn't even tell his parents until it was actually due to be announced. But we think that Fred Vasseur and those guys over there, Loic Serra, certainly going from Mercedes to Ferrari, they want to get Pierre Wache as well from Red Bull to go elsewhere. They might even want to get Adrian Newey, but that seems somewhat unlikely. But then again, if all of a sudden they're going to say, look, Newey, whatever we pay you is going to the cap now. We can't just pretend that we don't pay you as much as we actually do. So, you know, maybe we're going to have to come to a different solution here. Or maybe that could be the catalyst for other teams to swoop some of these guys up. So this has got to be a good change, but it's just so much of this stuff happens over the last couple of years that it's difficult as a fan of the sport to really have any faith that the FIA is actually implementing the cost cap as it was intended to be. And it's not even clear to me that the sport is in a better place because of it. Yes, last season, the qualifying performance delta between the worst and the best team was the closest it's ever been, which has been, you know, that's a good thing for the sport. But in terms of the races, the Red Bull was so far ahead of everybody else. It seems to still be that case as well. And the feeling is, and even Mercedes said this over the winter, they have changed so much on their car from last year to this. Last year, Mercedes would have brought a brand new chassis. They wanted to do a B version of last year's W14. They didn't have the money to do it. And over the winter, they've said, that they've changed most of the things they wanted to change, but under the budget cap, they couldn't even change everything. Like, there's still things on this Mercedes car that they wanted to do, but they just haven't had the money to do. So Red Bull, because they nailed it out of the gate, they've maintained that advantage, and the other teams don't have the money to actually catch that up. So, you know, there's an argument that the cost cap it's been pros and cons, but if one team comes out of the gate swinging, as Red Bull did, and let's be honest, will probably be the same thing in 2026 with whatever team comes out the gates hot then, it becomes harder than ever to actually catch up to that team. And, you know, we're probably going to have another 2 years of Red Bull domination based on what we see here. So the questions here are kind of twofold. It's like, does it work as a concept, as in, is the cost cap a good thing for the sport? But then also, even if it is, does it actually work? Can you even ensure that teams are following this? Which right now does not necessarily seem to be the case either. So hopefully I explained that reasonably enough. Thanks for 41,000 subs as well. We're getting so many subs yesterday. Really appreciate that one. And yeah, thanks for watching as always. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.